Hola, ¿qué tal? Tendemos a pensar en nuestras ciudades dando por sentado todo, sin caer en la cuenta de que muchas de sus características tienen que ver con la lucha contra la enfermedad. Las grandes pandemias, desde la peste bubónica de la Edad Media hasta la gripe española del siglo XX, fueron modelando nuestros espacios urbanos tal y como los conocemos. Verdaderamente, desde la planificación urbana hasta las alcantarillas, desde la recogida de basuras hasta el sistema de cañerías de las casas, son resultados de esa lucha contra las epidemias. Hasta los bulevares con los que el barón Haussmann redibujó París son el resultado de la lucha contra una gran epidemia, contra el cólera de mediados del siglo XIX. Por eso, en este ciclo de Repensando el Mañana, hemos querido preguntarnos cómo serán nuestras ciudades después de la crisis sanitaria. Y lo hacemos hoy aquí en este diálogo Ecosistema urbano tras la crisis sanitaria. Y además tenemos el privilegio de hacerlo con dos sabios de la arquitectura y del urbanismo. Ellos son Martha Thorne, que es directora ejecutiva del Premio Pritzker de Arquitectura, ya sabéis, el Nobel de Arquitectura, y que además es una gran conocedora de la arquitectura española. Ella es decana de la AIE School of Architecture and Design en Madrid, académica, escritora, divulgadora, siempre interesada por la arquitectura contemporánea, por su evolución y por cómo evoluciona el trabajo de los arquitectos. Nuestro siguiente invitado es Carlo Ratti. Él es arquitecto e ingeniero, investiga y enseña en el MIT de Massachusetts, donde fundó y dirige el Sensible City Lab. Además es socio fundador de la oficina de diseño internacional Carlo Ratti Associati, con sede en Turín, y una de sus pasiones es inventar e imaginar la ciudad del futuro y pensar cuáles van a ser los retos con los que nos tenemos que enfrentar. Vamos a saludar ya a nuestros dos invitados, Martha Thorne y Carlo Ratti. Hello, how are
Hola.
you?
Fine, thank you, a pleasure.
Well, since 1979, the Pritzker Prize has been awarded to living architects with works that demonstrate talent, vision, and commitment to humanity. Do we need that commitment to humanity more than ever?
Absolutely. Now more than ever, and I think it's become very obvious with COVID-19 just how connected we are to each other and how important physical space is. Therefore, commitment to humanity or service to humanity may take many different forms, as evidenced in the Pritzker Prize, but clearly trying to deal with complex issues such as the great pace and scale of urbanism, globalization, changes brought on by technology means that things have to be integrated. We have to be integrated with the physical environment. So I absolutely think that service to humanity, this commitment and making the connections is especially important.
Carlo, key decisions about cities and society should rest in the hands of the citizens. How can we do this now?
Well, I think all of the key decisions really should be in the hands of citizens. And, a city has always been a tension between top down and bottom up. But especially now, I think it would be citizens with their feet, making decisions about the city, about if they want to go back to offices after COVID, about how to use public space. So I think it should really be all of us to decide how to reprogram cities. And cities, are very resilient. Cities have gone through many epidemics, as you said. Think about Venice in the 14th century. 60% of its population died because of the Black Plague. But still, we still love its narrow streets. We still get together in its theaters. So somehow cities are resilient, but are reprogrammed. And I think it will be all of us as citizens to help in that process.
Maybe it's a bit early to take lessons learned about coronavirus, but we need a big conversation about the value versus the risk of densification. Could the coronavirus pandemic change how people look at urban density?
Martha, you're...
I have to jump in and say I sometimes have difficulty when we assume that it's an either or situation. When we say that the problem is density or the problem is X or Y or Z. I think what we have to do is density per se maybe is not the problem. It's one factor involved in it, but there are many aspects to density. And I think, Carlo, in this sense, you're a great help in the work you do at Sensible Cities Lab, because rather than stay at the surface of what is density, you dig deeper into issues. So density in a neighborhood, what kind of facilities we have in that neighborhood, how far do we have to travel to get to work or to get to primary health care. All of those are aspects of density that cannot be measured just by the number of people per square mile or square kilometer. So I would argue that density and pandemic, there is a relationship, but it's not so clear to say that if you have density, you're going to have a terrible pandemic. It depends on the type of density and how it's managed.
Carlo, what do you think?
And if we look at density and energy, there's a very famous curve that looks at all the cities in the planet, energy consumption per capita and density. And actually, the densest cities are actually the most efficient cities in terms of energy consumption. We also know that density is proportional to the exchange of ideas. So I think, if you are denser together, we create a more vibrant community. So I think density overall is a good thing. Of course, not in a pandemic, but I think it will be a transition phase. I don't know how long it will be, but we all hope in a vaccine, maybe 12, 18 months from now. And then at that point, I think we'll still want to be together, to be close to each other, because that is what a city is about.
I don't know, but maybe we have to think about a more decentralized city. I mean, for example, Paris Mayor Anne Hidalgo is aiming for a 15-minute city where most people daily needs are just a short walk away. Could this be a solution?
I think absolutely being able to walk to all the things that you need and having it close at hand is really probably a good idea. And that would be a good idea whether or not there's a pandemic. Because people, if they're able to walk to schools, to shops, if they're able to walk to the library, to see family members and friends, it has a lot of impacts that are positive, reduces traffic, it's healthier, people meet spontaneously on the street, it forms community. So I think the question is not necessarily decentralization, but multifunctional areas in the city, or bringing together different typologies, which is an alternative to the past. In many places we used zoning laws and industrial area, residential area, office area, and we tried to separate uses. And it seems that the way of the future is being able to combine and make compatible different uses so that they are more accessible to people.
Yeah. And, basically decentralize it certainly shouldn't mean what was done in the 20th century, which is actually this kind of endless suburbia. But what we can do is, more in line with what you just said about Anne Hidalgo in Paris and what Martha was saying, is, can we think actually a polycentric city? That's a city with different centers, and around every center, yes, you can be much more sustainable. There's also another interesting solution, and that solution is that, the city in the 20th century became very, very large. Think about, Beijing. If you go from Wangfujing in the center to the north, you're talking about tens of kilometers. So, you couldn't really walk there. Even the bike becomes an issue. But if you got an e-bike, then it gets better. If you got a scooter, so somehow micromobility with, new systems, electric micromobility, e-bikes, scooters, and so on, can actually be a way to expand our range without having to get back to the automobile.
That's an interesting issue, micromobility, because public transport highlighted as an environmental solution to pollution. But now public transport is not ideal in a pandemic situation. How can we do?
Well, I think it depends what we mean by public transportation. Again, we have to dig a little deeper in the definition. If it's the subway where everyone goes during peak hours and needs to get to another point of the city, or if it's having large buses that run on a schedule where we try to pack in as many people as we can to make it economically viable, then that type of public transportation is probably not the best for the times of a pandemic or even the future. But public transportation can be car sharing, can be bicycles, can be scooters, can be motor scooters. It can also be jitney services, service on demand, where we're using in a more efficient way a multiple or a great variety of different modes of transportation. And hopefully, if we can do this in a responsible and in a sensitive way, hopefully people will be served as well or better, and it doesn't have to be just the large bus or the large subway car.
Carlo, we need alternative ways to get around.
Yeah, I don't have much to add. We've been told that Martha and I have to disagree and have more be more provocative. But no, I kind of agree. Let me add maybe one point is really micromobility. I think is very interesting. One of the startups that came out of our research and our design work, Super Pedestrian, actually focuses on micromobility. And in micromobility, it's a simple idea. Again, during the pandemic, if you don't want to get back to the private car, get a scooter. You just need to make sure, maybe put gloves when you touch the handlebar. And, that's a better way. New York, most trips are, just, 1 or 2 miles. Why do you want to move? Tons of steel of an SUV to move to go 1 or 2 miles, to move 70 kilos. Our weight for 1 or 2 miles. I think, the best thing is, get a scooter, get a e-bike and, leave it there for somebody else to use. So micromobility can be a good solution in the midterm. And hopefully, like Milan is showing, I think Milan developed this ambitious plan with many more bike lanes and, helping people, giving incentives to buy scooters and bikes to all the citizens. Hopefully this can stay with us when the pandemic is over.
I think
I have seen your... No, Marta, please.
No, excuse me. I think it also, there also, of course, is a cultural element. And maybe this is where, Carlo, you and I can disagree or at least exchange ideas. I think one thing that we're learning with the pandemic is that things are going more slowly. If you have to wait in line to get into a shop or a pharmacy because there can only be 1 or 2 people at a time inside the store or the pharmacy, it's slowing things down. On the other hand, we have this great pressure from technology to do things instantaneously. So the idea that why should it take 30 seconds to boot up a computer when it should be done in 10 seconds? So how do we combine this idea of not having to instantaneously be at a place, do things really quickly, which in some ways technology is supporting or is encouraging, and on the other hand, thinking, well, it doesn't matter if it takes 5 minutes more to get to an appointment or to get someplace. And I'm not sure if we can ask for a cultural change, if it will come. And maybe technology is going to encourage us to go faster and faster. And there's where I think we may have a problem.
It's a very interesting point. I think technology is challenging some of that, they're going faster and faster. If nothing else, with technology or the new condition, the pandemic is challenging that today. And again, that might result in a different thing. Well, you're talking about the 5 minutes to get to an appointment, but both, I'm sure this is your case, my case, many of my colleagues, we've been for 3 months in the same place. I think it didn't happen in my life. I think since kindergarten, I haven't been moving around. I've been just locked down in a place. First in Boston, actually just a few days ago, I managed to fly back to Italy. It was quite an experience. It was actually, moving through airports and planes that were running, I guess, at 5 or 10% capacity for international flights. So certainly, we are doing many things in a slower way. We are moving less. And I personally think some of this is going to stay with us. Many of my colleagues are saying, for the first time, I can get much more done just because I don't need to commute to my office. And also, I don't need to be on a plane all the time. Hopefully, that will be better for the environment and better for us. But for both of you, Marta's with S, I have a suggestion that, to me, the exciting thing also for all the people who might listen to this is not necessarily what will happen during the pandemics in the next 6, 12, hopefully, not many months until when we find a vaccine or until when, like it happened in the past, we get some kind of group immunity. But then the interesting thing is, how will our cities be different, like in 5 years, because of this? What are the things that this will accelerate? I mean, somehow, the puzzling question is Twitter going to be right? As you know, last week, Twitter said everybody can work from home from now onwards forever. And so, we don't need offices anymore. If that were the case, our cities would be totally transformed. Now, I don't think that's the case, but I would like to ask this to you.
I think that there are three factors, and when we look at how the city might be in 1 year, 2 years, 5 years down the road. Of course, the physical environment is really important. And who makes that physical environment? If it's guided by the public sector, the private sector, if we change those guidelines for public space. A second factor is time. What is our relationship with time? And of course, we know before COVID, people left for work more or less at the same time, returned more or less at the same time. Children went to school. There was a strict schedule of hours to be at school. And I think with COVID, we're realizing that time is more fluid, and maybe we should be more flexible about time. So in the future, if we're not so rigid about time, and if we allow more flexibility in general, I think that will also change how we interact with the city and the physical environment. And then the third thing has to do with people. And the comment that we can all work from home, there are certain people who can work from home. And if we think about who those people are, they're in a job that is an office job. They probably have a large enough home so they have a workspace within their home. They probably don't have other obligations of small children or perhaps parents or grandparents that they have to take care of. And so for them to work at, and maybe they have a rich social network, that means that, well, even if they're at home, they have family or they have people that they're connected to. But think about somebody who's in a service job. They can't work from home. Think about someone who needs that interaction with people. Think about someone who has a very small apartment. There are a whole host of jobs, of people that are not just going to sit home and love it. And they're right now, I think with COVID, they're really struggling in a very profound way.
Yeah, it's almost
That's
like
very
COVID.
Interesting, because I think I want to ask you, this new way of work is revealing inequalities. I mean, the adaptation of the household for work is not the same for everybody. So there is another problem.
You're absolutely right. When people when people were talking about the digital divide, over the past 10 or 20 years, and they were saying people who are connected and people who are not connected. But now that divide is in most places. We are both of you are in Madrid, and in most of Europe, that divide has been solved. But there's a new divide, because even if you're connected, clearly, if you're an Amazon delivery person, you cannot be at home during the pandemic. If you need to drive an Uber, you cannot be. So it's a new divide that's emerging, and it's a more difficult and insidious divide. It is not a divide based on technology, but it's a divide based on the use we make of technology. And it's very important. At the same time, part of this divide can be addressed. So if you think about some other aspects, the ones that were mentioned before about, if you have an apartment that's very small, well, design can help actually still to adapt it and use it better. So you have a little corner where you can do your Zoom call or video conference without having some half-naked people or animals passing behind you, as we've seen over the past few weeks everywhere on Zoom calls. So I think, design can help. I as a designer, I think there's a very interesting challenge there. And the challenge is very similar to the challenge that we had in the 1930s, 100 years ago. That's when in Germany, we're talking about the existence minimum. What are the minimum things you need in an apartment? And at the time, there were a number of things that were defined. Actually, they were part of the constitution of the Weimar Republic, which were, the things that people need in their apartment because of lifestyle as it was 100 years ago. Then I think that somehow we need to reinvent the existence minimum, the minimum thing we need in our apartment, and redesign it in a way that actually can adjust to this kind of new condition that we're living in today. And again, help us bridge some of those divides. I had a couple of other points I wanted to make about, first of all, about time. I think the time component is very, very important. Now, time reminds me of how we managed the pandemic over the past few weeks. And then in the US, every time you turn on TV, the TV, it will be about flattening the curve. Flattening the curves means reducing peaks. Well, managing better time, for instance, in the way we commute to the office, means we can actually manage the peaks of the city better. So somehow, the problem of the city has never been capacity of the road network. Has been just that between 8 and 9 a.m., everybody was on the road network, and you had a peak, and it was chock-a-block. So somehow the same attitude of flattening the curve that we applied for addressing the pandemic, we can actually use for the city, to flatten the curve of the city, to use better the resources of the city. It can be the road infrastructure, it's about electricity, it's about public space, how we can basically reschedule the city so that we all benefit from this better distribution of the scarce resources that we have in urban space. So that's a comment on that. And then the final point that's the first point that Martha made was about the environment of the city, and that's also very important. It's one of our colleagues at Harvard did a paper that was probably you saw, that was very talked about by media, picked up by media. They saw that actually mortality was very linked with air pollution in cities. And so I think certainly we need to look at our cities, how we can clean up our cities, and there architects and planners have a big role to play. I think, it's a very important time for architecture and planning to really help rethink the city itself, the home, as we were saying before, and of course the office, if we need any.
Marta, sometimes we need to change some long-term habits, for example, drive to work at the same hour, to change the city. So maybe this is one of the major challenges to think out the box, to think other things, to the same problems of the past.
I think you're absolutely right. Changing behavior is not easy. It's like some physical materials that try to go back and to a natural state. So I think I worry a little bit that when the concerns about COVID are not so prominent and not top of mind, that we go back to bad habits from the past. So how do we change people's behavior? I think what we're seeing now with COVID-19, people change their behavior because they feel that what they do has a big impact or could have a big impact on their neighbors, their family, on other people. So it's like anything, if we can bring the story home to people and make it more real in a day-to-day life, then that's how people are motivated to change. I don't see people motivated to change if they're told this is good for you or this is bad for you. We have to really feel it inside of ourselves. And so I think things like air pollution, it's amazing because many of us are seeing how wonderful it is to breathe the air in our cities. And hopefully that in the future we'll remember this, and that could lead to some of those behavioral changes. I'm not sure, but I hope it will.
Well, here I got a good opportunity to disagree, but also I disagree just because I've seen coming back to Europe as Europe is in the lockdown. And, you really see that the city opens up, and the city goes back to the polluted city that was before. It's difficult to get back to that the sky, but I also hope that there's going to be the case. So somehow I think we probably want to wish for the best, but try still to plan for the worst, which is that some of these behaviors will be lost, and then we need to find another way to reenact them. I think I was a bit disappointed after reading about all the blue skies in Milan when I landed the other day at the end of lockdown, where it was really very quickly going back to the normal city with the same old behavior. So I think somehow we probably needed something else in order to do it, and that's imperative, because this almost felt, and many people commented on this, felt almost like a giant global test for another emergency, another crisis that's probably even more threatening, which is the one about climate change. And so we need to find a way to deal with this and to reinstate that good behavior. I don't think that's going to stick with us just naturally.
I think you're right, Carlo, and I'm sure you and Marta and I, we hear people talk about short-term protection against COVID-19, being opposed to sustainability, and we see this in many things, this assumption that we have to restart the economy and therefore people will die. Well, that may be true, but again, just being content or being complacent about, well, if we don't have COVID, we're going to have dirty air. That I don't think that's the option. And maybe, Carlo, this is where the mindset of architects and designers can help. Because again, I think it's a question of not only information, education, which is of course important, but giving examples that people can grab a hold of and say, this is an alternative. This is something real that can be in my life. And you've done that with the ozone cleaner. People didn't know didn't know what steps to take. But then when people see an example of what can be done to have a positive impact, I think it's easier for them to embrace
it. Yeah, you're right. I think the fact that the pandemic forces many around the world, a lot of us to, all of us to change our behavior. That is, what makes it tangible and then provides examples. So from that point of view, I'm optimistic as well, as you say, that, that out of all this kind of new behavior that somehow were forced upon us, then, some of those might stick. But unfortunately, the city as a whole, this kind of virtuous condition of the city with blue skies, no cars, no pollution, that's going to be more difficult to maintain. And again, as the lockdown is eased, it will unfortunately vanish quite soon.
I would like to speak about social distancing. The virus feeds on proximity, and proximity defines the city. Would we be capable of keeping social distance in our existing towns, and how urban design can help us in this point?
I think it is imperative to keep social distance during this crisis, and we don't know how long it will last. And there will probably be future crises. It's not going to be an isolated case. We don't know when, but it will probably return at some time. And again, this is where the physical environment, design, and how we use the physical environment is really important. I think things that are very obvious or even being implemented now, the idea that we're using streets or sidewalks for multiple purposes, closing a street so that people can exercise, they can use it as a place for walking, for running, for bicycling. So it's a more efficient use of the space and multifunctional use of the spaces we have. And I think there's another aspect, which is creating larger public spaces. If we have broader sidewalks, if we have more park areas, then we can allow more activities, whether they're commercial activities like terraces with restaurants or exercise, leisure activities. We can allow people to gather. So we need more physical space with or without COVID. We need to have multifunctional spaces with or without COVID. And then I think there are other design factors that we could look at, specific things that could come into play. But those two messages, more public space and more multifunctional space, I think are a start.
But we also want to get back to hugging and kissing, and that will get back. I mean, otherwise, would you imagine, Spaniards starting to behave like Americans, not even basically staying very far away, but big distance. I mean, that's not possible. I think, that will get back. And I'll tell you something more, that we did a project at our lab over the past few years, where we actually looked at viruses and bacteria in cities. So we collaborated we ran the project collaborated with many departments at MIT, in particular with a big collaboration with biological engineering. And basically we look at sewage, wastewater, and we looked at viruses and bacteria there. The idea for that is that, as you know, the microbiome, all the viruses and bacteria in our body is a key determinant of our health. And then we cannot monitor it for each of us on a daily basis, but we can do it on a daily basis, on an hourly basis. We can do it at the level of the neighborhood. So we started looking at this. and that, by the way, also led to a startup called BioBots that now is sampling 400 cities across the US in order to look at COVID and help to monitor COVID. Because you can monitor all the viruses and bacteria out there. But what you can do today with metagenomics, again, you get all the viruses and bacteria, and you can also look at a specific one with more specific PCR. And so is being implemented as we speak as a surveillance platform in the United States. Well, I'm saying this just to say, however, that all of this, in our body, we got for every cell, we got 9 or 10 bacteria and viruses living with us. And that's very important for our health. And actually, some of the issues that we see today is that we live in too much of a sanitized life. Then our microbiome suffers. You can look at this as a few papers that show that actually, if you live in the countryside, you have a more diverse microbiome, and also you're much more protected against many inflammatory diseases. A lot of the inflammatory diseases, the kind of epidemic of inflammatory diseases, and think about diabetes, think also about, there's a whole range of them, in degenerative diseases, including arteriosclerosis and Alzheimer, obesity, and so on. So, all of them actually are somehow related with our microbiome, which is all the viruses and bacteria living with us. So another thing we need to pay attention to is we also want to have the diversity in our lives. We cannot start living like we were in a hospital every day. And so I think that has to come back, that together with hugging and kissing.
I hope so. Martha, speaking about public spaces, we need to reshape these public spaces, more parks with different scales, with different uses. But maybe we need to reshape our hospitals too, because our hospitals used to be designed for chronic diseases and not for infectious diseases. And now maybe we have to think on another kind of hospitals.
Well, I think a really important step forward is that not only for hospitals, but many facilities, if there were teams in place that included architects and designers. And we have had great advances in hospital design. There are examples. We have one in Madrid, Maudes, which was a hospital built, I believe, around 1910, 1913. And it's in a star-shaped floor plan. So it did separate different diseases, different patients to prevent contagion, but also to help the staff so that they could see and access the patients easily. I think the key in moving forward is, again, the integration of architects and designers with health professionals, with the staff, with people who work in hospitals. It's also understanding that needs will change, and therefore these facilities somehow have to be flexible. I know that during COVID, and speaking to doctors who are friends, they said it was incredible how they were moving things from one place to another and trying to respond to the influx of patients with different needs, and many with COVID, of course. So embedding architects and designers in multidisciplinary teams would be a first start. And then I think looking at specific design elements in hospitals, not as something static, but something that can respond to the needs of patients, staff, but also to families of patients, to all the stakeholders. And I think that's where architecture has fallen short for many reasons, but the idea of it's a linear process. Someone commissions a building, an architect designs it, it's built, and we don't always go back for the post-occupancy surveys. We don't build in flexibility. So I think architecture and design has a lot that could be done, and it probably starts with that collaborative effort of the teams.
I would add, even in a more provocative way, I would even say that hospitals and universities are probably dinosaurs, and they really need to be rethought in a major way. And COVID might help that. COVID might help in different ways. The first way is that we are seeing that a lot of things have been moved to the home. I think for the first time I had a few visits with my doctor via Zoom, and it was totally fine. So somehow I think that the hospital itself might shrink quite a bit. You go for for an operation, for the OR, and for a few other things, and then for recovery. But many things, all the lab work can be done in a distributed way. A lot of things can be done at home. So think about a more network system could actually be very interesting. It could actually make healthcare much more accessible, especially in the United States. This is spun out of control. In the same way is also education. The cost of education is spun out of control. And again, what we are seeing now is, I think, students, going back to your initial question about it will be like a bottom-up push. I think students are now probably going to be the agent of change. Students are the one who are saying, well, why should I pay $50,000, $75,000 a year in order just to get an education via Zoom when I can get the same classes online for very little money. So this is going to, again, this crisis is going to question the university model, which has been the same more or less since Bologna. Bologna in the year 1000 is when the modern university started. It hasn't evolved that much. So I think, this could be, again, an interesting acceleration in order to make education, and not only healthcare, more accessible and more streamlined.
I have to respond a little bit to that, Carlo, because I think pressure on educational systems, just like pressure on almost any place, are really good to get us to think in new ways, to be more creative, and to use critical thinking about what we're doing. On the other hand, I don't think it's a simple question. Online, everything is the same. Why should I pay this online when I can get almost the same thing for free or reduced costs? We know that many years ago, MOOCs came into existence, free, massive, open online courses. And it's amazing. Most of the people who took a MOOC were people who already had a college degree. So we thought of this great promise of equalizing educational opportunity, and it didn't do that. So the pressure from the pressure from students will be good, but there are other issues there that have to be addressed.
No, on this, by the way, I didn't mean that the future university would be only MOOCs. We now know that MOOCs or massive online courses, what we're seeing when the equivalent of, edX or Coursera or Udacity, all of those repositories, they cannot substitute for the actual university education. There's much more to university education. There's peer-to-peer learning. There's exact serendipitous connections we were talking about before, about bumping into somebody else. But the interesting thing is that I think we'll need a new model, probably physical and digital together. Personally, I think we can certainly substitute a lot of the frontal classes with online classes. That's better for the professor. You don't need to repeat the same thing year after year. That's better for the students because you don't need synchronicity. You need to go to class exactly at that time. You can actually do things and look at that, watch that video whenever you want. But I think we can focus more on something else where actually physical presence is important, which is, more the lab, the place where, you meet one-on-one, where you ask questions, where actually both students can ask questions to professor, but also there's peer-to-peer learning. So my idea is that, the system will be probably a distributed system with physical nodes and virtual nodes. But to me, it seems, that the days of the traditional universities, kind of dinosaur that started in Bologna in the year 1000, they went through Oxbridge evolution, but it's still pretty much the same still today, are numbered. And I think, and the students will rightly demand a change. I think not because they will want to go fully online, but because of the pandemic, they will have to get online education. They're questioning then, what is the university really giving me? And so university will have to think about, how we structure the value chain again with both physical and digital nodes.
And I think in this sense, Carlo, we in the field of architecture and design, we have an advantage in some ways because architecture and design have traditionally been project-based learning. It's been collaborative or collective efforts in favor of looking at complex problems. And at my own school, we're instituting what we call liquid learning. And the great thing about liquid learning recognizes not only that there are many different tools and techniques for teaching online, face-to-face, laboratory, studio, etc., but also that people have different needs. So if someone may be able to come to the classroom every day, other people may not. And I think that, again, this idea of flexibility to be able to respond. And one thing you always talk about, the feedback loops. You learn more about what people need, what works, what doesn't work, and then you adjust. And I think, so that's where universities have to go on one hand. The other thing I hope and I think they have to do is rethink about their relationship with the broader society. Some universities do this more effectively than others. There are other ivory towers that don't reach out and don't become not only a university, but a good citizen in their community. And I think there's enormous power at breaking down those physical and also intellectual barriers that have separated universities from the city or from their communities. And there's a lot to be gained into making those connections more viable and more real.
I would like to come back to the hospitals issue because I love one question. Carlo, you have been working in an answer for the problem with hospitals now in the COVID. It's basically a modular construction. It's called cura, and it's an enclosed within a shipping container. Can these modular constructions would be a good answer now in this kind of crisis?
Well, let me tell you. Sorry, I think you will edit this. Let me tell you how this started. And first of all, I need to excuse myself if there's any architects, listening or watching. Believe me, I'm not a big fan of shipping containers. Shipping containers usually are seen not as something very sophisticated solution for a problem in architecture. Every student usually in the first year of architecture school uses shipping containers. But in this case, I'll tell you why they make sense. And it makes sense for the following reason. If you look at, the pandemic, we need more ICUs. We've seen it over the past few months. but we're seeing it now as we speak in countries such as Brazil. So we need more ICUs, and especially in the global south. Beware, the global south is where now the winter is coming in the global south. And so, it's expected that the infection rate will go up. And in the global south, sometimes the whole country has the same number of ICUs, of intensive care units, as a city in the US or in Europe. So I think, we need to scale up global ICUs. So how to do it? Now, what we've seen in China first, and then in Europe and the United States, has been twofold. One is to do temporary ICUs in a tent hospital or similar, like what we saw in Central Park in New York. Or the other option has been to do prefabricated hospital to be built very quickly. Now, the problem with the first one, with the tent hospital, is that you don't have negative pressure. In most cases, you don't have negative pressure. Negative pressure means that, because of negative pressure, air cannot get out of the place, and then cannot get out of the room or the intensive care unit. And so basically you confine the virus. It's called bioconfinement. And so because you don't have negative pressure in most cases, then you put the lives of many healthcare professionals, doctors and nurses at risk. And that's what we've seen in China, in Europe, a lot of them actually catching the virus and getting sick. And that has been one of the very big issues of this kind of temporary structures. On the other hand, if you do a proper prefabricated hospital, the time is much longer and the cost is much higher. So, you cannot afford it all the time. Plus, there's another important point, that what we are seeing now is that actually in this pandemic, in most pandemics, you got waves. And waves means that today, Milan, the crisis in Milan, then it was in Madrid, then now is in the UK, it's been in New York, and then it moves from city to city. And, if you think about a structure that's even a prefabricated structure, is very difficult to move. Even a tent hospital is very difficult to move because you need to pack and unpack everything, to mount it and dismantle it. And that takes a lot of time. And also, you got contaminated elements. So it puts many people's lives at risk. So because of all of this, we started looking, can we do something prefabricated? And that's why we look at containers. If you take a look at a shipping container, it can be very easily put into negative pressure, and then you can move it from city to city very quickly. Now, that was the initial idea, and then we asked ourselves, well, how do we do it? And there were two ways to do it. One way was a traditional design way, to talk to one of the healthcare groups and say, this is our design, why don't you produce it, and whatever, you develop in a traditional commercial way. But we decided that we needed a different model. And the model we opted for was an open source model. We used the open source both for designing the project, but also then for making it accessible to everybody. And so what was amazing is that in just 2 months, we were able to mobilize several hundred people who contributed to the project, who are now part of the community. We built the first units that have been installed a few weeks ago at a hospital in Italy. In Turin, thanks to the support of UniCredit, the bank. But also we got teams around the world who are taking the drawings, modifying them, and replicating the project. I love, the fact that people in Pakistan emailed us and say, this is great. It's still a bit expensive for our conditions, so we're going to modify it and start replicating. One of my favorite also initiatives is a group that used to work with containers, believe it or not, and actually building shipping containers with lights to grow cannabis in Canada. I guess legal. But then actually they said, they loved the project and started, using their skills in order to not to do shipping containers for cannabis, but for ICUs. So anyway, so for me, the two stories here are, the first one is about how we can take our skills as architects, designers, engineers, planners in a case of emergency. Somehow, never let a good crisis go to waste, how we can use the crisis to think how we can contribute with our skills. But the other part of the story is about the methodology. Is actually in this case how we can use a different model, the model of openness, of open source, of sharing things, not protecting with IP and patents, but really to sharing, and in order to be faster. And just to finish, if you think about the virus is code, is genetic code that replicates and actually attacks us. And one of the best ways to fight back is develop our own code. That's the code of design. Is design, it can be the design of Cura for an ICU. It can be the design the open source design of ventilators that our colleagues at MIT, some of the students and colleagues at MIT, put online immediately at the beginning of the pandemics, and many other open source designs that design the open source code that can be replicated and fight the virus back.
We tend to take design for granted, maybe because good design could be invisible, but design can help us and can save us. And this is an example. What do you think, Martha?
Absolutely. And I think not only good design or not only design, but this idea of open source or relying on many people, it's really in line with our concept of shared economy, where we're not waiting for a top-down solution or a one-source solution, but it's something that's shared. And as a matter of fact, the Fab Lab at my own school, which is located in our campus in Segovia, we were in contact with the regional government and produced headbands in the Fab Lab for the protective face masks that were needed so badly at the very beginning of the pandemic. And the important thing is not that we did it. The important thing is that we were part of a community that used design, that it shared design and produced it, and were able to together, from more bottom up or from side to side rather than a top down purchasing something, we were able to contribute to this effort. So I think design, we were laughing before that to some people design means Gucci or means a brand name. I think design in the 21st century means in responsibly, sustainably employing resources along with art and science to tackle a problem. But before just tackling that problem, proposing what that solution or what that idea is, and evaluating the impacts, making sure that it can be realized, making sure that it's useful, maintainable, and understanding the impacts. So for me, design, whether it's design of an object, whether it's design of a hospital, whether it's design of a strategy, whether it's design of whatever it is, that process can be very valuable. And I think it's something that not only is it valuable in terms of the results, but it helps us think in a new way how to approach problems.
But I'd like to agree on one point and disagree on another one. So I'll start with the one where I disagree. I don't think that design necessarily is about solving a problem. If we think about the most amazing design that was done in the 20th century, think about the design of the internet, the change. I think 1,000 years from now, when people will think about the past few decades, they will remember, if they need to remember one thing, that thing will be the internet that radically changed so many dimensions of our lives. And while the internet didn't start as a way to solve a problem, it started more as a dream. It's a dream to connect a computer with another computer. It's a dream of sharing information. And so somehow I love the definition of design by Herbert Simon. Herbert Simon is a great researcher and mathematician, and he won the Nobel Prize in the past century. And what Herbert Simon said, the natural sciences look at how the world is. Design looks at how the world could be. And by looking at how the world could be, it goes beyond just solving a problem. It's about imagining a new universe. Think about something that doesn't exist. Think about another design such as the iPhone that opened up a whole new series of applications we didn't have before, just because of a new design of thinking about how things, not how things are, but how things could be. And so design is really about building the future, about inventing, about trying things. And it follows something similar to what natural evolution does. Natural evolution tries, mutation and see what works. We try it in a slightly more thoughtful way, thinking about one direction versus another one. But again, we try many things. A few of them will succeed, and a few of them also will fail. And it's okay. It's part of the process. But where I totally agree, conversely, with what was mentioned, is design they can be either unite us or separate us. Martha said, design, some people, you say design, think about Gucci. And yes, even in architecture, just 1 or 2% of all the buildings on the planet are done by architects, then design is a way to separate us. Design is a way to say, yes, it's like the Gucci bag, or you have a house designed by an architect or something that's designed is a way to create a divide. But there's another way which is designed to unite us and to tackle communal challenges. And that's, the design that first of all you share, can be open source, the code is shared, what is happening, all the movement of the Fab Lab, but also, anything which is really designed is something that empowers people to take action themselves. Then that is design that brings us together. And I think that's a direction we should go towards. The other direction is a dead end, is, to use Bucky Fuller's words, the first Bucky Fuller's words were, utopia or oblivion. If design keeps in the old path, it's oblivion. But if we are able to follow the new one, tackle the giant issues we have today with this collaborative spirit, as we've shown during the pandemic, then it can be utopia.
Carlo, I agree with you on both things. It was probably a misstatement to say problem. It depends on how you challenge, maybe, is the thing. But obviously, the great strength of architects and designers is that ability to imagine the future. And more than any other professions, that opening the door to something that could be, I totally agree. So once again, we're aligned.
I would like to know if you think that now is time to reassess our built world.
The simple answer is yes. The real answer is more complicated. I think that our built environment is undergoing reevaluation by certain people. But I think the first thing we have to look at is who are the agents that create the built environment. And it would be great if we could say architects create or designers create the built environment. Let's talk to them and restructure, reevaluate, move the needle. But when we look at who creates the built environment, it's much more complex. Some parts of the built environment are created by architects, by designers. Some are spontaneous creations. Some are the result of certain policies or certain ordinances or norms. A lot of it is created by the private sector. And why does the private sector do certain things? Well, there are other agents involved that can be systems of finance, systems of construction, ownership of land. So the short answer, yes, let's reevaluate. The bigger answer, it's very complex, and maybe we have to look at some of those agents and see what their participation is and how they could change, because one sector of society can't do it alone, that's for sure.
And maybe it's more complex because we are facing an economical crisis now. I don't know, Carlo, what do you think?
Well, again, never let a crisis go to waste. I think the crisis is also an opportunity. Again, it's an opportunity to rethink many dimensions of our lives. And the built environment has a strange permanence. We still inhabit cities. They were built by Romans 2,000 years ago in different parts of the world. Cities that were built in the Middle Ages. Think about, a lot of Europe and different parts of the world. But what changes is really the way we inhabit the space, the way of living the space. And I think that's where we can all make a difference. The crisis then can help us to change our behavior, so we rethink not necessarily the hardware of the city, but the software.
Where we are at the end. No, Martha, please.
No, I maybe this is where we disagree, Carlo. I think I think the hardware and the software go together. So the hardware, sometimes the built environment, we can modify through behavior, through different customs, different ways of doing things. But I also think, and you even mentioned global warming, I think to change the built environment, we also have to change the built environment. We have to change how some aspects of the hardware of our cities. And those things are that combination of policies, of vision, of agents who are constructing the hardware of the cities. I would not be satisfied if we accepted the status quo going forward. I think there's too much room for improvement, too much room for those visions or dreams that you spoke of. Clearly, the built environment changes slowly. It lasts a long time. It takes a long time to build. But not because of that, we shouldn't think about alternatives.
Well, we're at the end of our conversations, but I have another question. We agree that architects can imagine the future. They can bring up questions about the future too. And I would like to know, what is the most important question right now in the architecture world? It's an easy one for the end.
Oh, goodness. I really don't know how to answer that question because I think there are probably multiple questions depending on who you ask. I think one from the point of view of education that we're grappling with is how you can create more sustainable environments. Realizing that global warming is a major, major issue. It's not just a question of reducing our consumption or limiting, but what are those ideas where we can make a more positive impact using the built environment, using the tools and techniques that architects have. So for me, I think that would be one of the big questions. Maybe on a personal level, another big question has to do with housing. We know that housing is not merely shelter. We know that about probably 25%, or well, I don't even know the percentage, an enormous percentage of the world's population lives in housing which is deficient. We can call it slums, we can call it favelas, whatever you want, but housing is a major concern. And so we need to think of how can we address this challenge. And it's probably not conventional architecture, conventional building, conventional methods. It has to be something else. But if we can't provide a basic necessity like housing for people, if they can't feel that they have a place where they belong, then I think we're really failing as a civilization, and we will fail in terms of our society and our world.
Carlo, what is the most important question right now in this moment for architecture?
I think it is it is the convergence between the natural and the artificial. So how that tackles all the issues related to the ecology, the planet, our cities, pollution. Is somehow this dichotomy between the natural world and the artificial world, how we can start doing co-evolution of the two, and architecture is at the core of that. And we, in our work, we try to do that in two ways. One way clearly is technology, sensors and actuators help architecture, the artificial world, to become and to behave in a way that's more similar to the natural world. But then the other way is really to bring more nature in our cities. And the two go hand in hand, and is really about co-evolution.
Martha Thorne, Carlo Ratti, has been a great pleasure to have this conversation with you. Thank you for your wisdom. Thank you for all the things that we have learned today with you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Bye-bye.
Y a ustedes, muchísimas gracias por habernos acompañado una vez más en este ciclo Repensando el Mañana y en esta charla Ecosistema urbano tras la crisis sanitaria. Teníamos muchas preguntas y gracias a Martha Thorne y a Carlo Ratti les hemos dado respuesta. Gracias por estar con nosotros ahí a través de esta pantalla. Nos vemos.